I don't think that there is much prospect of anything like a Second World War. For one thing, there's one superpower with overwhelming military force and no competitor. But that's not likely. The financial crisis was real. The sources are pretty well understood. They trace back to the significant economic shift that was undertaken in the United States, Britain, major powers back in the 1970s. At that time, the financial institutions, I'll keep to the United States, but similar elsewhere, the financial institutions were regulated under New Deal regulations. There hadn't been a financial crisis for the preceding years, which were the years of greatest economic growth in American history, the 70s, 50s, and the 60s. No crises, regulated. Financial institutions were there, but they were pursuing the function of such institutions. They have a function in a capitalist society. They're supposed to make use of to take unused assets like bank accounts and turn them to productive investment. That's their function, and that's pretty much what they were doing. Well, that changed substantially in the 1970s. There was the financial institutions exploded in power. There was a huge increase in flows of speculative capital. Then they were maybe a few percent of corporate profits. By now it's maybe a third or more of corporate profits. And they turned away from the from the constructive function in a capitalist society. They began to turn to risk, to essentially financial games, playing with money, risky investments, complicated exotic financial instruments. There's been crisis after crisis ever since, several during the Reagan years. In fact, Reagan left office in 1988, leaving a major financial crisis to be dealt with, the worst one since the Great Depression, savings and loan. The deregulation mania continued during the Clinton years under the dominant influence of financial institutions. By then, their increased role in the economy also meant increased political power. The Clinton years ended with another crash in the tech bubble. Got worse under the George W. Bush years, led finally to the current financial crisis. Each time, the problems remain the same, and the basis is laid for the next crisis. There's very limited regulation, which is almost a guarantee of crisis. What limited regulation there is by law is manipulated by huge armies of lobbyists, so almost nothing applies. It's inherent in market systems that transactions don't take account of what's called systemic risk. So, for example, if Goldman Sachs makes an investment or a loan, they take into account their own risk, but they don't take into account the risk of a breakdown of the whole system if something goes wrong. It's called, in economic jargon, externality, which you don't pay attention to. Well, that alone is a guarantee of crises, and that's increased by very perverse incentives. So one of them is a government insurance policy. It's called too big to fail. So if the major banks and investment firms make extremely risky transactions and hence make a lot of profit, and then it goes bad and crashes and maybe brings the whole system down with it, they can be confident that the taxpayer will move in and bail them out, which is exactly exactly what happened this time as in the earlier cases. That's called too big to fail, too big to let them go. Well, that's an insurance policy, which one of many, incidentally, which encourages highly risky and highly profitable behavior. The public will pay for it if anything goes wrong, so why not do it? Well, that's being reconstituted, so we're laying the basis for the next financial crisis, probably worse than this one. And that's almost inevitable when a market system in the financial arena is allowed to function with extremely little regulation and with incentives to carry out risky and potentially damaging but very profitable operations. That's all expanded by the exotic financial instruments that have been developed, various kinds of derivatives, insurance policies against loss, and so on, securitized mortgages, which was a core part of this particular crisis. All of that's reconstituted. So yes, there'll be another one. And by now the financial institutions are so powerful that they have overwhelming influence on the political system as well. One of the things that's happened is, over the past 30 years, dramatically in the United States, but elsewhere too, is the government policy. Traditionally, government policy in the Western state capitalist societies, the government has had something of, say, tax policy and other government policies have, to some extent, a minimal extent, but some extent, compensated for the enormous inequality that develops if market systems allowed to function freely. And in Europe, that's still partly the case. But in the United States, in the past 30 years, has been the opposite. The government policy has been designed to increase inequality very sharply. So if you take a look at taxes, they've been sharply reduced for the very wealthy, but sustained for the rest. And that, of course, has the exact opposite of what a tax policy is supposed to be in a modern society. That's a large part of the reason why the wealth has been so heavily concentrated in the top 1% or even less of the population. Policies are designed to have that effect. And there's a kind of a self-reinforcing cycle. The more wealth is concentrated, the greater the political power of that tiny fraction of the population who use that power to increase their wealth and privilege even more. That's